Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let me take you back to a time when letters traveled for weeks across quiet seas and rolling hills. Now our story tonight begins in the year 1767 in a cottage nestled at the edge of a sleepy English village, where the hills roll soft and endless like folded quilts and the air smells faintly of lavender, parchment, and woods. In that cottage, by the window, sat a woman named Eleanor, her figure calm and quiet beneath a shawl the color of ashen pearl. Her ink-stained fingers moved carefully over a piece of cream paper, lit by the soft flicker of a beeswax candle. Outside, the day was ending. A golden hue lingered at the horizon. The crows had already flown home, and the only sound in the room, besides the scratch of her quill, was the slow tick of the clock on the mantel. She was writing a letter meant for a man who had gone far away. His name was Thomas, and he had left for London 6 weeks prior on entire lifetime, it seemed, since she had heard his voice. Eleanor paused for a moment, holding the quill above the page. She watched a curl of candle smoke dance upward, and her breath followed it, soft and steady. My dearest Thomas, she had written. The rest came slowly, carried on a current of memory and hope. She told him of the orchard and the late bloom of apples this year. She described how their dog, Fitz, still barked at shadows in the corner by the barn, and how Mrs. Redley next door had taken to singing to her chickens again. And beneath all her words was something unsaid, something only letters could hold in those days. A quiet ache, a longing. It was not just ink she poured onto the page. It was the weight of absence and the warmth of connection. By the time she sealed the envelope with a trembling press of red wax, the candle had burned low. Rain began to fall again the next morning, light and steady, tapping like fingertips against the glass. In the countryside, far from London's busy corners and fog-draped streets, the meadows were turning a darker shade of green, the kind of deep green that only came with days of soft rain, when the earth was full and breathing, when the sky stretched low and gray like a woolen blanket across the hills. Eleanor stood in her garden, holding a small iron lantern. It flickered despite the drizzle. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, damp but warm. She had come out to check on the rosemary and the last of the summer lettuce, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Something inside her had shifted the day she handed that letter off. A quiet release, as if some part of her that had been held tightly had finally loosened. She didn't know it yet, but her letter had already arrived. Thomas had already read it, had already smiled, breathed, written something in reply. And even now, as Eleanor stood in her garden with the rain kissing her cheeks, that return letter was beginning its own journey, ink still fresh, sealed with the same careful wax, carried in the same slow hands of the world. The courier who first took Thomas's letter was a woman named Ruth. She worked the London to Medford route and knew every stone in the road by heart. She sang quietly to her horse when no one else was around, old songs, lullabies half remembered from her childhood. Her cart was modest, her coat patched at the elbows, but she carried her deliveries with reverence. Ruth had seen the value of letters. She'd once delivered a note that stopped a marriage, another that started one. She had seen tears fall on pages before they were even opened. She had seen old men hold envelopes to their chest and smile into silence. So when she received Thomas's reply, she tucked it carefully into the oilcloth pouch beneath her seat and gave it a little pat, as if to say, "We'll get you home." The rain followed her out of London, through muddy lanes where frogs leaped from puddles and crows circled low over fences. The roads were slick, the sky gray as slate, but she pressed on, slow and steady, stopping once beneath a willow tree to feed her horse and stretch her legs. The smell of wet grass and horses filled the air. Everything was quiet, save for the occasional splash of water falling from leaves. It was the kind of quiet that made time feel longer, but not heavier. As she climbed back into the seat of the cart and flicked the reins gently, the letter nestled against her knee. Somewhere ahead, a cottage waited, a woman waited, a story waited to return home. By the time Ruth reached the village post house near Eleanor's town, the rain had softened into a drizzle. She handed the letter to a young assistant named Corwin, who read the address twice and smiled faintly. He recognized the handwriting. He'd delivered the first letter only weeks ago, and remembered the woman at the gate, the one who smiled gently but with eyes that carried the kind of quiet a person felt more than saw. Corwin placed the letter in his coat, zipped it against the damp, and set out on foot toward her cottage. The walk wasn't far, a mile perhaps, past the old mill pond where ducks drifted slowly beneath a leaning willow, past the empty cart road where wild violets grew in the ruts between the stones. The rain tapped on his shoulders and his boots soaked through, but he didn't mind. There was something beautiful in delivering messages to people who truly wanted them. Letters that didn't speak of tax or purchase or business but of heart. When he reached Eleanor's cottage, the garden gate creaked softly beneath his hand. He followed the narrow path, flanked by herbs and ivy, and knocked gently on the oakwood door. Eleanor opened it before the third knock, her expression unreadable at first until her eyes caught the seal. And there it was. Her heart bloomed in her chest, slow and warm like a fire that had waited too long to be lit. She thanked Corwin with a whisper and closed the door softly behind her. Didn't open it yet, just held it, felt the texture of the paper, the impression of the wax, the subtle curve of his handwriting beneath her fingers. Then, by the hearth, with the fire crackling low and the light outside softening into a blue mist. She broke the seal and began to read. Thomas had written about the city, about the way carriages clattered through the streets at dawn, about the smell of ink and paper in the printing house, about the old woman who sold honeyed bread on the corner and always smiled with missing teeth. But beneath those words, Eleanor could feel it. His heart, his presence. "I missed the sound of your laugh near the garden," he had written. "I miss the way the hills turn blue in the evening, and I miss Fitzbarkin at shadows, but mostly, I miss you." Her eyes softened. Outside, the rain fell steadily, a comforting sound. The fire popped gently as the logs shifted, and for the first time in many days, Eleanor leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. The words she'd sent had gone far, but they had come back to her, fuller, warmer, alive, and the world, in all its slowness, had delivered them. Winter arrived quietly. The first frost came overnight, leaving a delicate silver veil over Eleanor's windowsill. When she opened the shutters that morning, the world beyond was hushed and white, as though even the wind had paused to admire the snow-covered branches. Fit bounded through the yard, barking at nothing in particular, leaving paw prints behind, like a child scribbling on a blank page. The chimney puffed gently behind her, and somewhere deep in the house, the kettle began to sing. Eleanor drew her shawl closer and stared out toward the road. The same winding path where her letter had once begun, where the boy Corwin had returned it, and where now, perhaps, another letter might arrive. It had become a rhythm between her and Thomas. Write, wait, receive. There was no urgency, no expectation of speed, just trust. A letter in those days was more than just paper. It was proof that someone had paused their day, dipped their pen, and thought of you, that they had stopped their world for a moment and folded a piece of it up just for you. And as the snow began to fall that morning, soft as flour through a sieve, Eleanor set her ink pot on the table and picked up her pen once more. Far away in London, Thomas lit a small oil lamp in his dim boarding room. His coat hung drying by the fire, and a mug of warm cider sat untouched beside a pile of books. The city had grown quieter since the frost. Boots crunched over frozen streets, windows glowed with candlelight earlier now, as dusk arrived like a gentle hush over the rooftops. He thought of her often in winter, how she always wore 2 scarves, how she baked gingerbread on the first snow, how she hummed when she walked between the rows of rosemary. Her letters had begun to carry more than just stories. They held small, pressed flowers, a short recipe, a poem he thought she might like, and in return, he sent her sketches of the city, lamplit corners, chimney-lined rooftops, pigeons gathered like gossiping grandmothers on the fountain rim. Even in silence, they had found a way to speak. He opened a fresh sheet of parchment, dipped his quill, and began. The roads in winter was slower. The frost, thick in the mud, the wind stung the cheeks of travelers, and the horses' breath steamed like chimney smoke against the morning light. But still, the letters moved slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the land. Ruth, the courier from autumn, had taken a new winter route, wearing a thick wool cloak and layers of sheepskin beneath her coat. Her fingers were always numb by midday, but she didn't mind. There was something beautiful in the way the world softened beneath the snow. When she rode, she kept the letters close to her chest, inside an inner pocket, not just for warmth but for safekeeping. She knew what they meant. On one icy morning, as the sun blinked through clouds like a sleepy child, Ruth stopped at the edge of a frozen brook. She dismounted to rest her mare and poured herself a bit of tea from a small tin flask. The world was silent, save for the occasional chirp of a robin in the hedgerow and the creak of ice stretching gently under the stream. She looked down at the letters, one in particular, sealed in green wax, marked private. She didn't know the sender or the receiver, but she imagined them. She imagined one sitting by a fire, waiting with quiet hope, and the other, perhaps, walking through snow-covered streets, glancing at the postbox each morning. And so she climbed back into her saddle, nudged her horse forward, and carried their words through the cold. Corwin, too, braved the chill. He wore gloves too thin for the work, but he didn't complain. Delivering winter letters always felt like bringing warmth where it was most needed. A letter in summer was a joy, but a letter in winter, that was something else. That was a fire. When he arrived at Eleanor's gate that morning, his breath puffing in clouds and his cheeks red as apples, she was already waiting. She opened the door before he could knock. There was no need to speak. He simply handed the envelope over with gloved hands, smiled, and turned back toward the road. Eleanor watched him disappear into the drifting snow, then turned the envelope over. She ran her thumb across the wax seal and smiled to herself. It still amazed her, even now, that something so fragile a letter could survive such a journey, could pass through hands and weather and time and still arrive whole. She carried it to the hearth and sat in her favorite chair, pulling the blanket over her knees. And there, beneath the soft hiss of the logs and the faint patter of snow outside, she opened it. Thomas's words were gentle. "Do you remember the frost on the barn roof the year of the early snow?" he wrote. "It looked like lace. I never told you, but I woke up early that day, just to look at it." He wrote about the candle shop near his lodging, and how the old man there gave him a sprig of holly with each purchase, about the fox he had seen in the alley 2 nights ago, about a book of poems that made him think of her, though he didn't say which ones. He asked if it still barked at shadows, and if the rosemary had survived the frost. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, it was as if he was there, not in a letter, not in ink, but in the room with her, watching the snow fall, a quiet smile on his face. She leaned back into the chair and let the feeling linger. Outside, the world continued its slow, snowy rhythm, but inside, warmth settled like a blanket over her shoulders, and the letter, folded neatly in her lap, rose and fell with the rhythm of her breath. Between the soft curl of ink and the warm rustle of opened parchment, there existed a space, an invisible thread stretched across the land. It wasn't just the space between Eleanor and Thomas, nor merely the miles of muddy roads and frostbitten valleys that separated them. No, this space was something more, something older, a kind of living silence that wrapped itself around each letter they exchanged. The roads between them held the shape of their longing. Those roads remembered. They remembered the weight of letters carried in saddle packs, the jostling rhythm of carts on cobblestone, the quiet footsteps of a courier beneath stars, the sleepy sound of an innkeeper yawning as he passed an envelope hand to hand, the warmth of a stable loft where wax-sealed envelopes slept among woolen coats. Even the wind seemed to know their story, how it would follow Ruth's cloak as she crossed the wooden bridge, or push gently at the shutters of Eleanor's cottage as she lit another candle to write. This was the unspoken promise of their correspondence, that between every dear Eleanor and yours always lay 100 unseen kindnesses, all carried by the roads between. Eleanor wrote again on the 2nd Tuesday of January. The skies had cleared for a moment, casting a pale light over the garden where frost clung to the bare stems of last summer asmint. The well beside the barn had frozen over. Fitz refused to step outside unless bribed with a heel of bread, and the wind howled each evening like a lost child at the corners of the house. And yet Eleanor smiled as she wrote. Her pen moved more azarely now, as if it to recognize the ritual. Each word warmed the air. The fire behind her crackled softly, releasing curls of pine-scented smoke into the rafters. The house was still, but her thoughts stretched miles ahead, already racing down the road her letter would take. Your last words stayed with me like song, she wrote. Even now, I hear them when the snow falls. She folded the letter, tucked in a dried sprig of thyme from the cupboard, and sealed it carefully with gold wax. There was no rush. She knew he would wait. She placed the envelope beside the door, then sat with a cup of tea, hands wrapped around the warmth, feeling the world slow once again. Corwin arrived that afternoon, just as the light began to dim and the birds tucked themselves into hedges. His boots crunched over frost-hardened ground as he approached the gate. Eleanor was there waiting, wearing her thick gray shawl and a red scarf that Thomas had once given her, years ago. You're early today, she said softly. He smiled. The road was kind this morning. She handed him the letter. He turned it over, as he always did, noting the seal, the care. Do you ever wonder where they go? She asked, half smiling. Corwin nodded. All the time. He didn't stay long, just long enough for a polite word and a tip of the hat. Then he turned back, toward the lane, the letter held close to his chest, protected from the chill. And just like that, the words were off again, carried by foot, then by cart, then by saddle. The journey this time was slower. A sudden snowstorm blanketed the lowlands 2 days later. Roads disappeared beneath mounds of powder. Trees bowed under the weight. Travel halted. Horses' inns overflowed with stranded passengers warming themselves by firelight. The letter rested for 2 nights inside a small postal station outside Chilwell, a sturdy timber building with a stone hearth and walls lined with sheepskin to keep out the cold. Inside, the courier on duty was an older man named Henry. His hands were knotted with age, but his movements were careful and loving, as though each envelope were a secret entrusted to him alone. He knew not to open them, but he liked to read the names on the front. He imagined their stories: young lovers, estranged brothers, cousins across seas, old friends from childhood. He could almost hear the echoes between the lines. When the fire crackled low, Henry sat beside it with the sealed letters in a wooden crate nearby. One of them bore Eleanor's name. He looked at it for a long moment, then returned it to its place. We'll wait out the snow, he murmured, as if the letters could hear him. Nothing is lost, just delayed. By the 5th day the sun returned. The ice melted in long silver threads down the roofs. The trees exhaled. Horses were resaddled, and the letters continued on their way. Ruth resumed the next leg of the journey, this time with a younger rider named Thomasine at her side. They traveled together for several miles, sharing salted nuts and dried fruit as they watched the white fields blur past. I think about what's inside them, Thomasine said, pointing to the leather satchel bouncing at Ruth's side. I don't, Ruth replied gently. Not exactly. I think about the hands that wrote them. They wrote in silence after that, letting the wind and hooves speak for them. But they were always speaking. And finally, one pale morning, just as a thread of sunlight slipped across the windowsill of Thomas's room, A knock sounded at the door. He opened it to find a courier, cheeks red, boots soaked through. "Letter for you, sir." Thomas took it, his hands suddenly unsteady. The wax was gold. The paper still smelled faintly of herbs and smoke. He closed the door, carried it to the window, and sat. For a long moment, he didn't open it, just ran his thumb along the edge, letting his heart catch up. Then he broke the seal. "When the snow falls," he read, "I hear your words like birds calling, each one a small prayer." The snow melted slowly that year. It didn't vanish all at once. It withdrew in quiet sighs, first from the sunlit corners of stone fences, then from the roads, then finally from beneath the trees, where it had hidden in silence for weeks. Eleanor stood on her porch one morning with her hands wrapped around a warm cup, watching a pair of sparrows bickering the hedge. The frost had lifted from the grass. Tiny green blades now pushed through the earth, and the wind smelled faintly of rain and something sweeter she couldn't quite name. Spring was near. She could feel it not just in the garden or the returning birdsong, but somewhere inside her chest. She had reread Thomas's last letter at least a dozen times. Some nights, she read it aloud by the fire, letting her own voice carry his words through the room. Each line felt like a breath in an otherwise quiet house. There was one passage she returned to again and again. "When the snow begins to melt, I shall find my way to you not through ink, but in step. I'll come home when the roads are soft again." She hadn't known what he meant when she first read it. But now, with the sparrows back and the soil waking up, she thought, perhaps she did. In London, Thomas folded his coat with careful hands. He packed lightly a small case, a journal, a wool scarf Eleanor had knitted him once years ago, and a parcel of letters she'd written over the winter, tied together with blue ribbon. He placed them gently on top of everything, like the final word in a long sentence. He looked around the room one last time. The ink-stained desk, the kettle that whistled too early, the window with its view of crooked chimneys and flickering gaslight. This had been a kind place for a while, a quiet chapter, but it wasn't where he needed to be anymore. The city was beginning to breathe again. Children played in the alleys with sticks and hoops. Street vendors had begun selling spring onions and bunches of violets tied with string. The world was turning again, slowly, like a wheel lifting from winter's stillness. Thomas stepped out into the street just as a soft rain began to fall, not cold, but fresh, the kind that made the stones shine and the trees tremble slightly with joy. He lifted his coat collar, smiled to himself, and began walking toward the coaching house, toward home. The roads, still damp from thaw, had turned to soft clay beneath the wheels of the coach, but the sky was clear, and the light grew longer with each passing day. The driver, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and gloves worn thin at the knuckles. He settled beside the window and watched as the city slipped away behind him, brick by brick, chimney by chimney. As the hours passed, the view softened. Smoke and stone gave way to hedgerows and lambs wobbling on uncertain legs. Daffodils peeked from ditch. The world was blooming slowly and surely, as if it had never forgotten how. Thomas didn't sleep. He watched the road and read Eleanor's letters again, letting his eyes skim familiar words with reverence. Some still smelled faintly of the cottage wood smoke herbs, the scent of quiet care. He imagined her reading his, tucked beneath her shawl, lips curling into the smile she only made when she was alone. The miles stretched behind him now. Only hours remained. Eleanor spent that morning in the garden, her hands in the soil. The rosemary had survived. So had the thyme. Tiny shoots of mint pressed their way through, and the bees, though few, had begun their return with sleepy diligence. She hummed softly as she worked, not for anyone else, just for herself and for the earth. In her pocket, she carried the most recent letter, folded once and worn at the edges. She didn't know when he would come. Perhaps next week, perhaps the week after. She had not asked. That was never their way. But she felt it, not in words, but in the way the birds returned, the way the sunlight lingered just a bit longer each afternoon, the way the wind no longer stung her cheeks but curled around her like something familiar. She felt it in her chest, like a candle waiting to be lit. By evening, she was inside preparing tea when Fitz barked Gasto. She froze, the spoon in her hand stilled mid. She moved slowly to the door, heart suddenly thudding like a drum. And there he was. Thomas stood just beyond the gate, his coat still damp from mist, boots stained with the dust of half the countryside. His hair was longer than before. His eyes were tired, but shining. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She stepped out into the cool evening air, and the moment hung like golden light between them. Then, with a soft smile, she opened the gate. He stepped forward, and the letter between them finally folded itself into something new. The door closed behind them with a gentle thud. Eleanor placed the kettle back on the stove, though neither of them said a word about tea. The house was warm, touched with the soft scent of pine and cinnamon from the dried herbs hanging above the hearth. Thomas stood near the window for a moment, eyes adjusting to the golden lamplight. His travel-worn bag rested by the door, untouched, forgotten for now. He turned to her. "You still wear the red scarf," he said softly. Eleanor glanced down at it, smiled, and tucked a loose end over her shoulder. It's warmer than the gray one. Thomas nodded. I remember. They stood like that for a while, surrounded by a stillness not awkward, not uncertain, just full, like the quiet that follows a symphony, or the hush that falls just before sleep. Then Eleanor motioned to the hearth. Sit. You look like the road rode you for days. He chuckled, low and warm. It did. The fire crackled as they settled into the chairs, one on each side of the hearth, with the space between them filled by soft flame and old memory. Fitz lay curled at their feet, letting out a deep, satisfied sigh. Outside, the night was settling in like a dark blue quilt, stars beginning to blink through the last silver threads of dusk. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment creased from travel, but still intact. He handed it to her. I started this one on the road, but I didn't finish it. Thought maybe I'd rather say it aloud. Eleanor unfolded it carefully. The ink trailed off halfway down the page. She looked up at him, curious. Thomas leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. There were things I kept writing and rewriting, things I wanted to tell you in letters, but the ink didn't do them justice. She waited. He looked into the fire. I never knew I'd miss silence until I missed yours, he said. The kind of silence that only happens when you're near, when nothing has to be said. Eleanor's lips curled at the edge. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my quietness. He grinned. It's my favorite part of you. They didn't rush the words. The room seemed to stretch to hold them, like time was moving just a bit more slowly here. She finally asked, why now? What made you come? Thomas thought for a moment, then said, the waiting changed. It stopped being about distance. It started feeling like forgetting, like if I didn't return soon, the letters wouldn't be enough anymore. Eleanor nodded. She understood. There's something sacred about waiting, she said softly, but only when it leads somewhere. He reached for his cup of tea and found it empty. He didn't mind outside an hour cold once from the woods. A breeze moved through the chimney. Fitz stirred but didn't lift his head. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, folding her legs beneath her. I always wondered, she began, when we stopped writing out of duty and started writing, just to hear each other's thoughts. Thomas looked at her carefully. You knew the moment. She smiled. The letter with the sketch of your street lamp. You said the way the snow caught in the glass reminded you of stardust. I didn't think you'd notice. I'd notice everything. They talked into the night. Not all of it was meaningful. Some of it was about the baker down the road, who had married the widow from Kent. Some was about Fitz's strange new habit of growling at birds. Some of it was just laughter, overlapping and light, but even the smallest words was stitched with something deeper or something unspoken, yet clearly felt. And when the fire began to burn low and the candles trembled on their wicks, Thomas leaned back and let his eyes close for a moment. Not from exhaustion, but peace. I forgot how quiet it is here, he said. Eleanor rose and fetched another blanket from the bench. She draped it over his shoulders and sat across from him again, watching the embers flicker red and gold. It's quieter when you're here, she whispered, but not in a lonely way. Whole way. For a while, they just listened to the fire, the wind, the heartbeat of the room. No letters needed to be written tonight. No words left unsaid. In the space between the ticking of the clock and the slow rhythm of their breath, they found something better than conversation. They found presence. The next morning broke slow and golden. Soft light filtered through the curtains in long beams, catching tiny flecks of dust in its warmth. The hearth had gone to ash in the night, and Fitz lay curled near it, his tail flicking gently in sleep. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the cottage walls, greeting the pale sky. Eleanor stood at the kitchen counter, pressing dough into a small round loaf. Her hands moved without hurry, folding and turning, the soft thump of her palms echoing gently in the still room. Behind her, Thomas was just waking. He sat up on the little cot tucked beside the sitting room window, rubbing sleep from his eyes with the back of one hand. He didn't speak right away, just watched her for a while, quietly, as if unsure whether the moment was real or part of a lingering dream. It felt good to wake to warmth, to wake to the scent of flower, wood, and rosemary. Eleanor turned, catching his gaze. Sleep well. He nodded like the road had never existed. She smiled and wiped her hands on her apron. Good, there's more tea in the pot, and the bread won't take long. He rose slowly, stretching once, then walked to the window. Outside, the garden had begun to bloom at the edges. A few clusters of crocus pushed out between patches of melting snow. Life was creeping back in with soft footsteps. He looked down at the coat he had worn for months, creased, worn thin at the elbows, and thought of the dozens of letters tucked deep in its pockets. Letters sent, letters received, and others that never made it past the page. Later that morning, while Eleanor was in the garden gathering sage and sprigs of chive, Thomas sat at her writing desk. A soft breeze drifted through the open window, stirring the edge of a nearby curtain. The room smelled faintly of ink and lavender, with an old oil lamp casting a soft glow even in daylight. His fingers grazed the surface of the desk. Smooth wood, familiar. He pulled open the top drawer not to snoop, just to see. Inside were stacks of paper, 2 quills and a small bundle tied in string. Curious, he untied it gently. There, folded neatly, were pages of writing, all addressed to him, but none had been sent. His name was written at the top of each letter in her unmistakable hand, sometimes flowing, sometimes hurried, but always him. They were dated throughout the past year, spring, then summer. One just after autumn began, a final one in December. He didn't read them, not at first. He simply held them, feeling their weight, knowing that for each of these, Eleanor had sat here, heart full and hands poised, choosing again and again to speak through the page, even if no one ever heard the words. There was a reverence to the act. Not sadness, exactly, but something close, a tenderness that bordered on ache. After a moment, he took the last letter and read just the first line. If I knew for certain you would read this, I might finally tell you what I haven't been able to say out loud. He folded it again, gently, and returned the bundle to the drawer. Some letters weren't meant to be mailed. Some were simply meant to be written. That night, by the fire once more, Eleanor noticed he was quieter. She poured him tea and handed it over without a word. He accepted it, warming his hands around the mug, and said, I found the letters. She didn't flinch. I didn't read them, he added. Just one line. Eleanor nodded slowly. Her eyes didn't leave the fire. They weren't meant to be sent, she said. Not because I didn't want you to read them, but because sometimes writing was the only way I could hold the space. He understood. I've done the same, he said. Letters, the first burned. Pages I tore in half. Eleanor glanced at him. Why tear them? He shrugged, almost smiling. It felt dramatic, like the page couldn't hold what I was trying to say. They both laughed softly, and the firelight danced between them. There are always things we don't say. Not because we don't want to, but because we don't yet know how, or because timing, like the post roads, is winding and unpredictable. And yet, the unsent letter still serves. It shapes us. It makes space. It teaches us how to listen to ourselves before speaking to another. That night, Eleanor and Thomas sat with all that was unspoken, not as a burden, but as a presence. The letters remained in the drawer, not hidden, not forgotten, just resting. And they, too, rested, side by side with the slow crackle of the hearth, the occasional creak of the floorboards, and the silence of two people who had once written through distance, and now simply sat together, writing nothing, needing nothing, just here. The first storm of spring came just after dusk. It didn't announce itself with thunder or wind, but rather with a stillness, a kind of heavy hush that settled over the land like a held breath. Even the birds fell quiet. The trees stood motionless, their branches reaching into a gray sky smudged with clouds like wet charcoal. Eleanor stood at the threshold of the cottage, just beneath the awning, watching the last light slip away. The clouds swirled gently above her, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of turned soil, of distant lightning, of something about to begin. Behind her, Thomas stirred the fire with a poker, coaxing the last embers into a steady flame. Fitz had already curled himself beneath the window seat, his paws twitching faintly in sleep, and then the rain began. It started as a whisper, a soft pattering on the roof, like fingers tapping a lullaby. Then it deepened, growing fuller, until the world outside became a rhythm, a pulse that wrapped around the cottage like a song. Eleanor stepped back inside and closed the door gently. She turned to Thomas with a smile. It's a good night for stories, she said. He nodded. Always. The storm wrapped around them, but inside, all was warmth. Eleanor lit the lamp on the table, its glow golden and soft, casting flickers across the worn wood and the small stack of unread books resting nearby. She handed Thomas a blanket and curled into the chair across from him, tucking her knees beneath her. The fire cracked once, and the wind moaned gently against the shutters. It wasn't a loud storm, it was the kind that asked you to listen closely. You used to love storms, Thomas said, watching the flames. When we were younger, you'd run out barefoot and catch rain in your palms. She smiled. I still would, if the ground weren't so cold. Thomas leaned back, his fingers laced behind his head. I used to think you had some kind of agreement with the weather. Maybe I do, she whispered. The rain picked up, steady now, and the wind carried the scent of wet grass through the tiniest cracks in the windows. The room dimmed, softened, cocooned in the hush that storms often bring. I wrote you a story once, Thomas said, after a while. Eleanor tilted her head. I never sent it, he added. It was too strange, too unlike the other letters. I wasn't sure what you'd make of it. She leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above the fire's whisper. What was it about? Thomas paused. Thought it was about a man who couldn't speak, he said, but every night he would write notes and leave them in bottles in the river, hoping the current would carry them to someone who'd understand. Eleanor smiled. And did someone? He nodded. A woman upstream found them. She couldn't read, but she kept the bottles anyway. Said they were the most beautiful things she'd ever owned. Eleanor let that sit for a moment, her eyes flicking to the window where rain now streamed like silver threads down the pane. You still have it? She asked. Thomas shook his head. No, I burned it one night. Thought it was silly. She frowned softly. You should have sent it. He looked at her, half smiling. I'm telling you now, aren't I? She chuckled. Yes, and I think the woman was right. It is beautiful. The thunder came late, rumbling low in the belly of the sky. Not frightening, just there. a reminder that the world was alive outside their little circle of firelight and woven blankets. Eleanor rose and moved to the window. She pressed a palm to the cool glass and watched as the garden disappeared beneath ripples of rain. She could just make out the rosemary plant, sturdy and low, bending in the wind but not breaking. "You know," she said softly, "every letter I sent, I imagined the road. I imagined the storms it crossed, the hands it passed through, the saddlebags, the cold mornings, the long stops at inns where no one spoke." Thomas joined her at the window. "I did the same," he said. "I'd picture the envelope settling in a basket, a stranger reading your name, the candlelight over your handwriting." They stood in silence a while, side by side, just breathing. "Strange," Eleanor said, "how we imagined the same journeys and now we're here, together, after all those miles." "Not strange," Thomas whispered. "Just meant." That night neither of them wrote. There was no need. Outside, the rain sang the story for them. It carried the memory of all the miles their words had traveled. It carried the time it had taken to finally sit, side by side, in the same room, without parchment or seal or courier between them. There would be letters again, eventually. But tonight only presence mattered. The fire dimmed, the rain softened, the wind settled, and the cottage held them gently in its quiet arms. The storm passed in the night. By morning, the world outside was washed clean. Raindrops clung to every surface, each leaf, each blade of grass, even the line of stones along the garden path. The air was still, but filled with the scent of something ancient and new all at once. Wet earth, moss, the faint sweetness of turned petals, and the lingering hush that always followed rain. Eleanor stepped into the yard with bare feet, letting them sink into the soft ground. The earth was warm beneath the surface. She knelt beside the rosemary bush, running her fingers along the damp branches, checking for damage. But it had held, as it always did. Behind her, the door creaked, and Thomas stepped into the golden morning light. He stood quietly, watching her move between the beds of herbs and early spring bulbs. It was the first time he had seen her here, in her rhythm, in her morning peace, without needing a letter to tell him what it looked like. He smiled. She turned and caught his eye. "I was just checking the mint," she said. "It gets temperamental after storms." Thomas joined her, crouching low beside a cluster of new shoots. His hands brushed the dark soil. "You've rebuilt this garden every year," he said. Eleanor nodded. "Some things don't survive the frost, but most come back, if you're patient." He looked at her. "You included." She didn't answer with words. She simply stood and offered him a hand. They spent the morning working together, gathering broken branches, brushing the soil from scattered leaves, righting a few stones that had shifted under the weight of the rain. It was quiet work, comforting. Not every moment needed words. Not when your hands could speak, when your presence could reassure, when the rhythm of shared tending was its own language. Later, they sat on the bench near the old willow, cups of warm water steeped with lemon balm resting between them. The tree's long limbs swayed gently in the breeze, and a few birds dipped down from its crown to drink from puddles pooled in the grass. "I remember writing you about this bench," Thomas said. "When you first had it built, I imagined what it looked like, but I pictured it wrong." He nodded. "I thought it was wood, straight old, with a creak, but this is smooth, stone, like it belongs here." "It does," she said. "It's been here longer than anything else in the garden." He ran his hand along the worn surface. "Funny how many details I got wrong." Eleanor turned to him, eyes soft. "You got the important parts right." In the days that followed, the garden became their rhythm. Each morning began the same, with birdsong, the distant call of a cockerel, and the low rattle of a kettle heating on the stove. They would tend to the sprouts together, plant new bulbs, clear the path. By midday, the bees had returned in earnest, drifting lazily between the violets and the chives. Eleanor would hum while she worked. Thomas often listened. Sometimes he sketched pages filled with vines and leaves, with her silhouette bent gently over a row of seedlings. He rarely showed her the drawings, but she knew. And in the evenings, they sat again by the hearth or walked quietly down the lane, talking not just of the past but of what might come. Letters were no longer necessary, but they still wrote. One afternoon, Eleanor returned from town carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She placed it on the writing desk and untied it to reveal a new stack of parchment, several fresh quills, and a glass bottle of dark green ink. Thomas looked up from where he sat, planning to write again. Eleanor smiled. "Always." She handed him a page. "For you, in case the words come." He nodded and accepted it with a quiet reverence. And so, the letters began again, not because they needed to bridge a distance, but because some things are too lovely not to write down, because some words, even when heard aloud, still deserve to live on paper. Thomas wrote about the shape of Eleanor's hands in the garden, about the way her hair caught the wind when she turned toward the willow, about how the sound of her laughter made him feel like the house itself was breathing. Eleanor wrote about the stories he told in passing, the sketches he left tucked into books, the comfort of waking to the smell of his tea brewing beside hers. They wrote because it was how they had first loved one another. And even now, especially now, it still felt sacred. And slowly the garden bloomed. It wasn't sudden. It never was. But by the end of April, lavender stretched along the border wall. The mint had spread its roots again, wild and defiant. Tomatoes pushed upward on new stakes. Even the bees moved with more purpose, as if they knew they'd been waited for. In the center of it all stood two people who had written through seasons, waited through storms, and now, finally, tended to something growing in the soil and in themselves. No longer only through parchment, but through presence, through hands, through patience, through a letter never needing to end. The sun was higher now. The days had grown long, stretching like cats in the warmth, lazily unfurling from cool mornings into gold-washed afternoons. Insects buzzed in the tall grass. Wind shifted through the open windows of the cottage, lifting curtains like soft sails. It was on one such quiet day, while Thomas was away fetching honey from the neighbor's apiary, that Eleanor found herself opening the desk drawer again. The old one. The one with the letters. She hadn't looked at them since before the storm, since before his return. But now, with the house still and the garden tended, she felt the pull not of need, but of gratitude, a kind of ritual, a revisiting of who she had been during the waiting. She untied the bundle slowly. Each envelope was still just as she had left it, creased slightly from folding. Ink soft and faded at the edges, but whole, unsent, sacred. She spread them across the writing table, fingers brushing the familiar handwriting. Some pages held only a few lines, others spilled long across both sides. Some had little pressed flowers tucked between the folds, others carried smudges from hurried tears or cold hands, and yet every one of them hummed with presence, not longing exactly, but devotion, the kind that doesn't cry out to be answered, the kind that is content just to be. She reread one or two. A letter written during the first frost of winter, when the silence of the house had felt loudest. Another written after a thunderstorm, when she'd lit a dozen candles to feel less alone. And one dated midsummer that spoke only of the garden, which herbs had bloomed, what the wind had smelled like, how she missed his handwriting most of all. As she read, she realized something surprising. They weren't sad, in fact, they were full of life. She'd thought, when she wrote them, that they were scribbled in sorrow. But now, with Thomas back in the house and sunlight pooling over the floorboards, she saw them differently. They were acts of hope. Each letter, though unsent, had been a seed planted in the silence, and now the garden of her waiting had bloomed. When Thomas returned, he found her at the desk. She didn't look up right away. She was smoothing one of the envelopes flat with the back of her hand, not with sadness, but with the same care she gave to herbs when she tied them for drying. Reverent, steady, he stood in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, watching her in the light. "You're reading them?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Yes, I thought it might be time." He came closer, setting the jar of honey on the sideboard, then pulling a chair beside her. She looked at him. "I thought they were full of sorrow, but they're not." "I never thought they would be," he said gently. She smiled. "They're full of you." He reached for one of the letters but paused before touching it. "May I?" She nodded, and so he read just one. It was a short letter, no more than a page, written in spring, full of descriptions of the garden waking up, the ache of missing, the warmth of memory. When he finished, he folded it once and placed it back in its envelope. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. What should we do with them?" Eleanor thought for a long moment. "I'm not sure," she said at last, "but I don't think they should be hidden." Thomas nodded. "Then let's make a place for them." That evening they cleared a small shelf in the sitting room. They placed the bundle of letters in a wooden box, nothing ornate, just a plain pine box with a smooth lid and brass clasp. Eleanor tied them with a fresh ribbon, soft blue, like the spring sky just after dawn. She wrote a small note and placed it on top. "These are the words that kept me company." Then they closed the lid and placed the box between two books, one of poems, the other of pressed flowers. Not to forget, but to remember. Kindly later, by the fire, Eleanor spoke again. "I used to think letters were about delivering news," she said, "but they're not." Thomas turned to her. "They're about holding space," she continued, "about giving shape to something invisible, a thought, a feeling, a hope." He nodded slowly. "Even when they're never read." "Especially then," she whispered. The fire cracked softly, sending up a curl of smoke and a tiny flare of orange light. The clock ticked faintly in the next room. The wind had fallen still, and in that silence, neither of them wrote. But they didn't need to. Some letters had already been written in the air between them. In every shared glance, every passing smile, every tender silence that now lived without effort. They had become the story now, not in ink, but in being. If you enjoyed drifting away with tonight's tale, let your support be felt with a gentle tap on the like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe and share this story so that others can find their way to sweet dreams, too.